In the summer of 1972, dozens of black children from the poorest neighborhoods of Atlanta, Georgia, vanished. They were not taken from parks or street corners. They were taken from the sterile, white-sheeted beds of a city hospital. Their disappearances explained away by a bureaucracy that saw them as disposable, their names fading into the silence of forgotten files. For 30 years, their stories were ghosts, whispered memories in households hollowed out by a grief with no name. The silence was finally broken in 2002, when a young journalist, chasing a different story entirely, stumbled upon a dusty box of lab records in a forgotten archive. The discovery of their names, cold and clinical on the yellowed pages, would not be the end of their story. Instead, it would be the beginning of a relentless search for a monstrous truth, a secret protected by power and time, and a fight for a justice that was 30 years overdue. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. The Atlanta City Archives in August of 2002 were a place of profound and musty silence, a tomb where the city's paper past was laid to rest. For Simone St. James, a journalist with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, it was also a place of profound frustration. At 28, Simone possessed a restless, impatient intelligence and a deep-seated intolerance for the slow, grinding machinery of bureaucracy. Her current assignment, a sprawling multi-part series on the decay of Atlanta's public institutions, felt like a punishment. She was supposed to be uncovering the dramatic, headline-grabbing stories of malfeasance and corruption, but instead, she was spending her days sifting through an endless necropolis of financial ledgers and procurement forms, the mundane, boring bones of civic life. Her target for the week was the now-defunct Crestwood General Hospital, a massive public institution that had once been the city's pride before it had collapsed under the weight of budget cuts and mismanagement in the late 1980s. Simone was looking for a smoking gun, a clear line item that showed a city councilman siphoning funds or a contractor overcharging for services. Instead, she found only the slow, sad story of institutional neglect. On her fourth day in the archives, a weary, overworked clerk, eager to get her out of his hair, pointed her towards a section of the Crestwood collection that had not yet been properly catalogued. "It's mostly old administrative stuff," the clerk said with a dismissive wave. "Personnel files, inter-office memos. Knock yourself out." The boxes were stacked in a dim, poorly lit corner of the basement, coated in a thick, velvety layer of gray dust that seemed to swallow the light. It was in this forgotten corner of a forgotten archive that she found it. It was a simple, unassuming cardboard records box, its sides softened and slumped with age. Unlike the other boxes, which were neatly labeled with fiscal years and department codes, this one had a single handwritten label in faded blue ink. P.I.P. Clinical Data 1971-73. Simone, driven more by a desire to leave no stone unturned than by any real sense of purpose, pried open the crumbling lid. The contents were not the financial records she was looking for. Instead, the box was filled with thick, heavy stock folders, each containing what appeared to be highly technical medical research notes. The pages were a dense, almost indecipherable forest of scientific jargon, chemical formulas, and complex dosage charts. It was clearly the raw data from some long-dead research project. It was useless for her story. She was about to close the box and move on when a single, separate folder caught her eye. It was thinner than the others and was simply labeled Subjects Master List. Curiosity, the essential and often unrewarded engine of her profession, made her open it. Inside was not a chart or a graph, but a simple, typed list. It was a list of names, dozens of them, arranged in neat alphabetical order. Abbott, Marcus, Baker, Daniel, Collins, Loretta. Each name was followed by a date and a 7-digit number. The list felt cold, impersonal, and strangely out of place among the dense scientific data. Who were these people? The dates were all from 1972. The 7-digit numbers looked like medical record numbers. These were the patients, the human subjects of the research. Simone felt a faint, inexplicable chill in the hot, stagnant air of the basement. There was something about the list, its stark, clinical presentation, that felt wrong. It was the kind of feeling that had always served her well. A quiet alarm bell that went off in the back of her mind when a story was hiding just beneath the surface. She looked back at the box. P.I.P. What did that stand for? She found her answer on the title page of one of the research binders. The Crestwood Pediatric Immunology Program. This was a children's study. The names on her list were the names of children. She carefully, almost secretively, slipped the folder into her briefcase. She didn't know what she had found. It was probably nothing, just a list of patients from a 30-year-old study. But as she walked out of the silent, dusty archives and into the blinding glare of the August sun, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not carrying a piece of history. She was carrying a list of ghosts. The city desk of a major newspaper after midnight has a unique, almost sacred atmosphere. It is a place of artificial light and stale coffee, where the frantic energy of the day has subsided into the quiet, focused hum of a few dedicated night owls chasing the stories that the rest of the world has forgotten. For Simone St. James, it was her sanctuary. She sat at her cluttered desk, the glow of her computer monitor casting a pale blue light on her face. The city of Atlanta sleeping outside her window. The list of names from the Crestwood archives lay beside her keyboard, a silent 30-year-old challenge. Her initial attempts to find information had been fruitless. The names were too common. The time that had passed too long. She needed more than a name. She needed a context. Her first breakthrough came from a deep dive into the newspaper's own digital archives. She ran a search for Crestwood General Hospital in 1972. The results were a flood of articles about budget crises, union disputes, and a glowing profile of the hospital's brilliant and charismatic head of pediatric research, a doctor, Julian Cross, who had just secured a major federal grant for his groundbreaking work in immunology. But then, buried deep in the search results, she found a different kind of story. It was a small, 3-paragraph article from the Metro section, dated September of that year. The headline was simple: "Community Leaders Question Police Response to Missing Children." The article detailed the growing concern in Atlanta's predominantly black South Side neighborhoods over a recent string of missing children cases, all of which the Atlanta Police Department had summarily dismissed as runaways. Simone felt that familiar, electric jolt of adrenaline, the feeling of two seemingly unrelated facts beginning to snap together into a single, coherent picture. She turned back to the list of names from the archive. She picked one at random: Abbott, Marcus. She typed the name into the search bar, along with missing and 1,972. The result came back instantly. It was a tiny, almost invisible classified ad, placed in the paper a week after the Metro article had run. It was a simple, heartbreaking plea from a mother, accompanied by a grainy, low-resolution school photograph of a smiling, gap-toothed little boy. "Missing," the ad read. "Marcus Abbott, age 7, last seen at Crestwood General Hospital on September 12. If you have any information, please call Thelma Abbott at..." The phone number was 30 years old. Simone's hands were trembling slightly. Coincidence was a luxury a good journalist could not afford to believe in. She picked another name from the list: Baker Daniel. She ran the same search. The result was the same. Another classified ad, another grainy photograph, another heartbroken plea. Last seen at Crestwood General. Then another name: Collins, Loretta. The same result. One by one, she began to work her way down the list. With each name, the same horrifying pattern emerged. Abbott, Baker, Collins, Davis, Edwards. They were all there. Every single name on Dr. Cross's clinical research list belonged to a black child from a poor neighborhood who had been reported missing in 1972, and the last place any of them had been seen alive was Crestwood General Hospital. The scope of what she was uncovering was staggering, monstrous. This was not a story about a few isolated cases. This was a systematic disappearance of dozens of children, all from the same demographic, all from the same institution. She cross-referenced the dates. The date next to each child's name on the lab list was, in almost every case, the exact date they had been admitted to the hospital. The date they were reported missing was always a few days later. The official police files, which she was able to access through a friendly source in the records department, were a study in institutional indifference. The reports were thin, filled with cursory notes and judgmental assumptions. Mother is single, works nights, family is transient. Subject has a history of truancy. In almost every case, the investigation had been closed within a week. The child branded a runaway. Their disappearance a sad but unremarkable statistic of urban poverty. Simone leaned back in her chair, the fluorescent lights of the newsroom suddenly feeling harsh and cold. The story she had been assigned was about the decay of a building, about the dry rot of financial mismanagement. But the story she had found was about the decay of a city's soul. It was about a crime so vast and so terrible that it had been hidden in plain sight for 3 decades. The children on her list had not run away. They had been erased. And the last person to see them, the man whose research they had been a part of, was Dr. Julian Cross, the celebrated, brilliant scientist. Simone looked at the grainy photo of Marcus Abbott on her screen. He was no longer a ghost. He was a victim. And she, Simone St. James, was going to be his witness. The long, silent night was just beginning. The memory, for Thelma Abbott, was not a faded, distant thing. It was a sharp, vivid, and perpetually open wound. The year 1972 was not a time of bell-bottoms and disco music for her. It was the year the world had ended. In the early autumn of that year, she was 23 years old, a young woman whose life was a constant, exhausting tightrope walk of survival. She worked nights at a textile mill, her body aching with a fatigue that never seemed to lift, her hands raw from the constant work. But her life was not defined by its hardships. It was defined by the fierce, all-consuming love she had for her son, Marcus. At 7 years old, Marcus was her entire universe. He was a brilliant, joyful spark of a boy, a whirlwind of boundless energy and a smile that could light up their small 2-room apartment. He loved to draw, filling notebooks with his own cast of superheroes, heroes who were all strong, brave, and black. His only shadow was the asthma that sometimes tightened its grip on his small chest, a wheezing, persistent ghost that terrified Thelma more than any bill she couldn't pay. One cool September evening, the ghost returned with a vengeance. Marcus's breathing became a ragged, desperate struggle for air. The home remedies, the steam from the shower, the Vicks VapoRub she slathered on his chest, nothing worked. In a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled panic, Thelma wrapped him in a blanket, ran out into the street, and flagged down a taxi she couldn't afford. "Crestwood, General," she gasped, her voice tight with terror. "And please, hurry." The hospital was a world away from their small, vibrant neighborhood. It was a massive, imposing fortress of brick and glass, its very architecture seeming to radiate an aura of cold, white authority. Inside, the emergency room was a chaotic, impersonal hive of activity. Thelma felt small, invisible. A poor black woman with a sick child, lost in a system that was not built for her. After what felt like an eternity, they were seen. A young, tired-looking doctor examined Marcus, his manner brisk and professional. He confirmed it was a severe asthma attack and said Marcus would need to be admitted for a few days of observation and treatment. As they were being moved to the pediatric ward, a different kind of doctor appeared. He was older, in his 40s, with a handsome, reassuring face, kind eyes, and a mane of distinguished graying hair. He moved with an air of effortless, unshakable authority. His white coat was immaculate, his voice a smooth, calming baritone. He introduced himself as Dr. Julian Cross, the head of the hospital's pediatric research program. "I was just reviewing your son's case, Mrs. Abbott," he said, his smile warm and paternal. "He has a particularly persistent form of bronchial asthma. We see it all too often in children from this part of the city." He spoke to Thelma not as a frightened young mother, but as an intelligent partner in her son's care. He explained that his department was working on a new, cutting-edge treatment protocol, an experimental regimen of medications designed to not just treat the symptoms, but to actually strengthen and rebuild a child's respiratory system. "It's a chance to give him a future without this illness constantly hanging over his head." "Doctor," Cross explained, his voice filled with a compelling, almost messianic passion. "The treatment is entirely voluntary, of course, but I believe it could change your son's life." Thelma, exhausted, terrified, and desperate for any glimmer of hope, clung to his words. He was a man of science, a man of power, a man who seemed to genuinely care. He was offering her a miracle. "Will it cure him?" she asked, her voice a small, hopeful whisper. "We have had some truly remarkable results." "Doctor," Cross said, his kind eyes meeting hers, "I have every reason to be optimistic." Thelma, overwhelmed with gratitude, agreed without a moment's hesitation. She signed the consent forms he provided, her signature a shaky, hopeful scrawl on a page filled with technical language she didn't understand. As Dr. Cross left, a nurse came in to check on Marcus. She was a black woman, older than Thelma, with a kind, weary face and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, unassailable sadness. Her name tag read, Hattie Devereux. She adjusted Marcus's pillows and checked his breathing with a gentle, practiced hand. She didn't say much, but as she was leaving, she paused at the door and looked back at Thelma. There was a look on her face that Thelma would remember for the rest of her life. It was a look of profound, almost unbearable pity. It was the look of a woman who wanted to say something, who needed to say something but could not. At the time, Thelma dismissed it as the simple compassion of a good nurse. It would be 30 years before she understood that it had been a silent, desperate warning. Simone St. James believed in the power of the official record. It was the bedrock of her profession, the source of the hard, verifiable facts that could topple politicians and expose corruption. But as her investigation into the missing children of Crestwood deepened, she found that the official record was not a rock. It was a wall, a smooth, impenetrable surface designed to deflect and conceal, not to reveal. Her first formal requests to the Atlanta City Health Department for the full medical records of the children on her list were met with a swift and categorical denial. The reason given was patient privacy, a noble-sounding excuse that was, in this case, a cruel and infuriating absurdity. The patients were missing, presumed dead. The hospital was a shuttered ruin. The privacy being protected was not that of the victims, but that of the perpetrators. She tried a different angle. If she couldn't get the medical records, she would get the police files. She called her source in the records department, a man who had helped her on previous stories. But this time, his voice was strained, nervous. "Simone, I can't help you with this one," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The Crestwood files from that era. They're flagged. Restricted access. I'd lose my job just for looking." Flagged? A 30-year-old set of files on missing children from the ghetto? That was more than just bureaucratic inertia. That was a sign of an active, ongoing cover-up. It meant that someone, somewhere, was still protecting the secrets of Crestwood Hospital. Frustrated but not deterred, Simone decided to track down the men who had written the reports in the first place. She spent days poring over old police rosters, making calls and chasing down leads. Most of the officers who had worked Atlanta's South Side in 1972 were either dead or had long since retired to Florida. But she finally found one. His name was Frank Donovan, a retired detective sergeant living in a small, tidy brick house in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac, a world away from the streets he had once patrolled. He was a man in his late 60s now, with a florid, whiskey-veined face and the kind of deep, weary cynicism that comes from a lifetime of seeing the worst of humanity. He agreed to speak with her, but his hospitality was laced with a gruff, defensive hostility. Simone sat across from him in his cluttered den, the air thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke and old paper. She laid out her case, showing him the list of names, the newspaper clippings, the pattern of disappearances, all linked to Crestwood. Donovan listened, his face an unreadable mask. When she was finished, he let out a short, harsh laugh. "Lady," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp, "you're chasing ghosts, and you're wasting your time." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You gotta understand what it was like back then. The South Side was a war zone. We were dealing with murders, armed robberies, dope, real crime. And you want to know why we didn't spend a month looking for some kid who ran away from home? Because that's what they did. The mothers, half of them were single, working 2 jobs. The fathers were nowhere to be found. The kids ran wild. They'd run off to a cousin's house in another state and no one would know for a month. Or worse." He shrugged, a gesture of profound, ingrained indifference. It was what it was. We didn't have the manpower or the time to play social worker. But dozens of them? Simone pressed, her voice sharp with an anger she was struggling to contain. All from the same hospital, in the same year? That's not a coincidence, detective. That's a pattern. Donovan's face hardened. It was a charity hospital in the middle of the ghetto, he shot back. Of course, they all came from there. Look, you're a kid. You don't get it. You're trying to put today's rules on yesterday's world. It doesn't work like that. He stood up, a clear signal that the interview was over. As he walked her to the door, his tone softened slightly, taking on a note of what sounded almost like a warning. "Take a bit of friendly advice," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Let this one go. There's nothing there but a lot of old, sad stories. You go digging up graves, all you're gonna get is dirty." Simone walked away from Frank Donovan's tidy suburban house, her mind reeling. He was not just being dismissive. He was being deliberately obtuse. He was a man who knew more than he was saying, a man who had made a conscious decision 30 years ago to look the other way. His indifference was not just a personal failing. It was a professional one. It was the official indifference of an entire system, a system that had deemed these children unworthy of protection, their lives not valuable enough to investigate. Donovan had not just been a detective, he had been a gatekeeper. He and men like him had been the first line of defense for whatever terrible secret was hiding in the heart of Crestwood Hospital. He had warned her she was digging up graves. He was right. But he was wrong about one thing. She had no intention of stopping until every single one was opened. The first few days after Marcus was admitted to Crestwood were a blur of cautious optimism for Thelma Abbott. The doctors and nurses in the pediatric ward were kind and efficient. The treatments seemed to be working. The terrifying, ragged wheeze in her son's chest had subsided, replaced by the steady, peaceful rhythm of healthy breathing. By the 3rd day, Marcus was his old self again, a bright, energetic force of nature, sitting up in his hospital bed and filling a notebook with drawings of his latest superhero, Captain Comet. He was bored, he was restless, and he wanted to go home, all of which were beautiful, wonderful signs to Thelma. She spent every moment she wasn't at the mill by his bedside, reading to him, playing checkers, and basking in the simple, profound relief of his recovery. Dr. Cross would visit them each morning, his presence a calming, authoritative reassurance. He would speak to Marcus with a gentle, grandfatherly affection, and then he would explain the medical charts to Thelma with a clarity and respect that made her feel like a valued partner in her son's healing. "The protocol is a remarkable success," he told her on the morning of the 4th day, his handsome face beaming with professional pride. "His lung capacity has increased by 30%. We're seeing a significant reduction in bronchial inflammation. He's responding even better than we had hoped." He told her that Marcus would need to stay for just a couple more days of observation, and then he could go home. For good. Thelma felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She had trusted this man, and he had delivered a miracle. That evening, when she left the hospital to go to her night shift at the mill, she kissed Marcus goodbye, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "I'll be back first thing in the morning to pick you up," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And we'll go get some ice cream. Any kind you want." Marcus, his eyes bright and clear, hugged her tightly. "Chocolate," he said with a grin, "with sprinkles." It was the last time she would ever see him. The next morning, Thelma arrived at the pediatric ward, her purse containing a small, carefully saved amount of money for the promised ice cream. She walked down the familiar antiseptic-smelling hallway, her steps quick with anticipation. But when she reached Marcus's room, she stopped dead in the doorway. The room was empty. The bed was stripped, the bare mattress staring up at the ceiling like a blind eye. The small table where Marcus's drawings and comic books had been was wiped clean. It was as if he had never been there at all. A cold, sickening dread began to creep up her spine. She found a nurse at the main desk, a woman she didn't recognize. "I'm here to pick up my son," Thelma said, her voice tight, trying to keep the rising panic at bay. "Room 412. The nurse typed the name into her computer terminal, her expression bored and indifferent. "Abbott, Marcus," she said, not looking up. "He was transferred." Thelma stared at her, her mind struggling to process the word. "Transferred? Transferred where? No one told me about a transfer." The nurse shrugged. "It says here he was transferred to the Northwood Children's Convalescent Center. The order was put in by Dr. Cross last night. You'll have to speak to his office if you have any questions." Thelma's panic gave way to a frantic, desperate energy. She ran to the administrative wing, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found Dr. Cross's office, but he was not there. His secretary, a severe-looking woman with a helmet of lacquered hair, looked up at her with an expression of pure annoyance. Thelma, breathless and on the verge of tears, explained who she was. The secretary listened with a cold, impatient detachment. "Yes," she said, her voice a flat monotone. "Dr. Cross was called away to an important conference in Baltimore. He left instructions regarding your son," she explained, in a tone one might use to describe a piece of misplaced luggage, that Marcus had suffered a sudden, severe, and unexpected relapse late last night. His respiratory system had collapsed. Dr. Cross, in his professional judgment, determined that your son required a level of specialized, long-term care that Crestwood is not equipped to provide, the secretary recited, her words clearly coming from a script. "He personally arranged for an emergency transfer to the Northwood facility upstate. It's the best place for him." She handed Thelma a sheaf of official-looking paperwork, a transfer authorization filled with complex medical codes and signed with Dr. Cross's elegant, looping signature. Thelma looked at the papers, her vision blurring with tears. It didn't make sense. He had been fine. He had been perfect. How could this have happened? "I need to talk to him," she pleaded. "I need to know where my son is." The secretary's expression hardened. "Dr. Cross is unreachable. The facility has been notified of your son's condition. They will contact you in due course." She stood up, a clear dismissal. Thelma was escorted out of the office by a hospital security guard, her mind a maelstrom of confusion, fear, and a growing, terrible suspicion that she was being lied to. She spent the rest of the day in a frantic, desperate search for the truth. She found a payphone and called the Northwood Children's Convalescent Center. The woman who answered the phone was polite, but her words were a death blow. They had no record of a Marcus Abbott being admitted. They had received no transfers from Crestwood General last night. They had never even heard of Dr. Julian Cross. Thelma called the hospital back, but she was stonewalled, transferred from one indifferent administrative assistant to another, until finally, no one would take her calls at all. She went to the police, but they were no help, treating her story with a mixture of bored skepticism and outright suspicion. A missing child, or a hysterical mother who had perhaps misplaced her own son. They took a cursory report and told her they would look into it. She knew they wouldn't. In the space of a single morning, her son had not just been taken from her. He had been erased, his existence swallowed by a wall of bureaucratic lies and official indifference. Thelma Abbott walked out of the police station and into the harsh afternoon sun, a woman who had just been hollowed out, her heart replaced by a cold, empty space that would ache with the same unanswered question for the next 30 years. Where is my son? The data was a skeleton, a cold, hard framework of a crime. Simone St. James knew that to make the world care, to make them see the humanity behind the numbers, she needed to give that skeleton a heart. She needed a voice from the past. A human story that could bridge the 30-year gap and make the tragedy of 1972 feel immediate and real. She needed to find Thelma Abbott. The phone number from the 30-year-old classified ad was, as expected, long disconnected. But the ad had given her a name, and a name was a starting point. Simone was a master of the modern journalist's art of digital archaeology. She spent 2 days in the labyrinthine world of online public records, cross-referencing voting registrations, property deeds, and utility bills. She traced the faint, fading paper trail of Thelma Abbott's life, a life lived in the quiet, working-class neighborhoods of Atlanta's South Side. Finally, she found her. A Thelma Abbott, age 53, living in a small, modest bungalow in the historic but now struggling neighborhood of Summerhill. Simone drove to the address on a Saturday afternoon. The house was small but immaculately kept, its tiny front yard a riot of colorful, well-tended flowers. It was the home of someone who cared, someone who fought against the slow tide of urban decay with a fierce, quiet pride. Simone took a deep breath, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervous anticipation and a profound sense of trespassing on sacred ground. She was about to knock on the door of a woman whose deepest wound she was planning to reopen. She knocked. The woman who answered the door was small and slender, her hair streaked with gray, her face etched with the fine lines of a life that had not been easy. But her eyes were what struck Simone. They were large, intelligent, and filled with a deep, weary sadness, the eyes of a person who had been waiting for a long, long time. "Mrs. Abbott?" Simone asked, her voice softer than she had intended. "My name is Simone St. James. I'm a reporter with the Journal-Constitution." Thelma Abbott's expression did not change. She simply nodded, a gesture of weary resignation, as if she had been expecting this knock on the door for her entire life. "I know who you are," she said, her voice a low, soft alto. "You're the one who's been asking questions about Crestwood." The neighborhood grapevine, Simone realized, was still faster than any internet connection. Thelma looked at her, a long, appraising gaze. "You'd better come in," she said, opening the door wider. The inside of the house was a museum of a life that had been frozen in time. The furniture was old but well cared for, and on every available surface, the mantelpiece, the end tables, the walls, were photographs of a smiling, gap-toothed little boy. School pictures, candid snapshots, a formal portrait. It was Marcus. In this house, he was not a 30-year-old memory. He was a constant, living presence. He was 7 years old, forever. They sat in the small, quiet living room, and Simone, as gently as she could, explained what she had found. She showed Thelma the list of names from the lab records, her son's name prominent among them. She told her about the pattern, about the dozens of other children who had vanished in the same way, from the same hospital. She laid out the cold, hard facts of the conspiracy she was beginning to uncover. Thelma listened in a state of profound, almost unnerving stillness. She did not cry. She did not rage. The time for that had passed decades ago. She simply absorbed the information, her expression a mask of deep, sorrowful validation. She was not crazy. She had not imagined it. The things she had known in her gut for 30 years, the terrible truth she had never been able to prove, was finally being laid bare. When Simone was finished, Thelma spoke, and for the next 2 hours, she told Simone her story. She recounted every detail of those terrible days in 1972 with a clarity and precision that was breathtaking. She remembered the smell of the emergency room, the texture of the hospital sheets, the exact words Dr. Cross had used to sell her his miracle cure. She described the empty bed, the cold, dismissive face of the secretary, the infuriating indifference of the police. She spoke of the years that followed, the years of lonely, desperate searching, of writing letters that were never answered, of making calls that were never returned. She spoke of the slow, crushing realization that the world did not care about her son, that a poor, missing black child was a problem the city would rather forget. They made me feel like it was my fault, Thelma said, her voice finally breaking, a single tear tracing a path through the lines on her face. Like I was a bad mother, like I hadn't watched him closely enough. They took my son, and then they tried to take my sanity. She looked at Simone, her eyes filled with a 30-year-old pain. You believe me, don't you? Yes, Simone said, her own voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond professional sympathy. I believe you, and I'm going to make sure everyone else does too. As Simone was leaving, Thelma stopped her at the door. There was a nurse, she said, her brow furrowed in concentration as she dredged up a long-buried detail. A colored nurse. She was kind to Marcus, but she looked so sad, so scared. I remember her name tag, Devereaux, Hattie Devereaux. It was a small detail, a name that had been floating in the ether of Thelma's memory for 3 decades. But Simone knew, with a sudden, absolute certainty, that it was not just a detail, it was a key. It was the name of the one person who might have seen what happened to Marcus Abbott after his mother had kissed him goodbye. The world of a hospital is divided into floors of light and floors of shadow. The upper levels, the patient wards and surgical suites, were places of bright, sterile efficiency. But the basements, the labyrinthine corridors that housed the laundry, the morgue, and the boiler rooms, were a different world entirely. In 1972, the West Wing basement of Crestwood General was the domain of Dr. Julian Cross. The other hospital staff rarely went down there. It was a place of whispers and rumors, a place they called the quiet floor. Hattie Devereaux knew why it was quiet. It was because the children who went down there never came back up. Hattie was a good nurse. At 38, she was a veteran of the Crestwood Pediatric Ward, a woman who moved with a quiet, calming competence. She had a gift for soothing a frightened child, for reassuring a panicked parent. She loved her job. But for the past year, her job had become a source of a deep, corrosive fear. She had seen the pattern. A black child would be admitted with a common, treatable illness, asthma, sickle cell anemia, severe influenza. They would begin to recover. And then, Dr. Cross would sweep in, his handsome face radiating a paternal concern, and he would talk to the parents about a new, specialized treatment protocol. The parents, poor, often uneducated and desperate, would always agree. The child would then be transferred. But they weren't transferred upstate. They were transferred downstairs. Hattie had seen it happen a dozen times. She would see an orderly wheeling a sleepy, sedated child towards the restricted access elevator that led to the West Wing basement. The child's chart would be marked with a simple TO for transfer order, signed by Dr. Cross. And then, the child would be gone. Their bed would be empty the next morning. The official story was always the same. A sudden relapse. An emergency transfer to a long-term care facility. But the nurses knew. They didn't talk about it, not openly. But they knew. They would exchange quiet, fearful glances in the hallway. They would see the fresh grief on a mother's face, and they would have to bite their tongues until they bled. To speak up was to risk everything. A black nurse in a white-run hospital in 1972 had no power. She was disposable. An accusation against a man as powerful and as celebrated as Dr. Cross would not be an investigation, it would be a career suicide. On the evening of September 12th, Hattie saw the orderlies come for Marcus Abbott. She had grown fond of the boy over the past few days. He was bright and funny, and he had a talent for drawing that reminded her of her own nephew. She had watched with a growing sense of dread as Dr. Cross had charmed his young mother, had seen the hopeful, trusting look in Thelma Abbott's eyes as she signed the consent forms. Hattie knew what was coming. She saw them wheel Marcus, sleepy and docile from a sedative she had not administered, down the long, quiet hallway towards the elevator. She saw the look of confusion in his eyes, and she had to turn away, a wave of nausea and self-loathing washing over her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run after them, to snatch the boy from the gurney and take him back to his mother. But she didn't. Fear, cold and paralyzing, held her in place. She thought of her own children, of the mortgage on her small house, of the precariousness of her position. Dr. Cross had made it clear what happened to staff who asked too many questions. A few months earlier, another nurse, a friend of hers, had made a quiet inquiry about one of the transferred children. 2 days later, she was fired, accused of stealing hospital medication. Her nursing license was suspended pending an investigation that never concluded. The message was clear: be silent or be destroyed. So Hattie remained silent. But she could not remain passive. She had to do something, some small act of witness to defy the monstrous silence that was suffocating her. After her shift, her hands trembling, she went to her locker in the staff changing room. From the very back, hidden beneath a pile of old magazines, she took out a small, cheap spiral notebook. It was her secret, her sin, her only act of rebellion. She opened it. The pages were filled with her neat, precise handwriting. It was a list of names. Each name was followed by a date and a single, coded letter. A for asthma, S for sickle cell, I for influenza. It was her own private, heartbreaking record of the disappeared. She found a blank line. With a heavy, aching heart, she wrote, Marcus Abbott, September 12, 1972. A. She closed the book, her conscience at war with her instinct for survival. She was a powerless witness, a silent accomplice. The secret diary was her only proof that these children had existed, that they had been taken, and that at least one person in this cold, heartless place had remembered their names. The story was no longer a secret. The moment Simone St. James began making official inquiries, the moment she started tracking down retired detectives and asking questions about a 30-year-old hospital, she had tripped a silent alarm. The ghosts of Crestwood were not all dead, and the ones who were still alive had a great deal to lose. The pushback began subtly. The source she had cultivated at the city clerk's office, the one who had confirmed the police files were flagged, suddenly stopped returning her calls. When she finally got him on his personal line, his voice was a panicked whisper. "I can't talk to you anymore," he said. "I was called into my supervisor's office. They know I was talking to you. They didn't threaten me, not exactly. They just reminded me how close I am to my pension." The message was clear. The wall of silence was being reinforced. Then came the email. It arrived in her inbox late one night, from an anonymous, encrypted address, the kind that was impossible to trace. The subject line was a single word: warning. The body of the message was equally brief and chilling. Stop digging into Crestwood. Some graves are best left undisturbed, for your own well-being. It was a classic, movie-style threat, the kind she had only ever read about, but seeing it on her own screen, in the quiet solitude of the newsroom, made her blood run cold. This was not the work of some low-level city bureaucrat. This was the work of someone with resources. Someone with a sophisticated understanding of how to intimidate and how to hide. The people she was investigating were not just powerful 30 years ago. They were still powerful today. Her editor, a seasoned, old-school newsman named David Chen, saw the threat and the institutional stonewalling not as a reason to back off, but as confirmation that she was on the verge of something huge. "They're scared," he said, a grim, excited smile on his face. "And scared people make mistakes. Keep pushing." He moved her off all her other assignments and gave her the full resources of the paper's investigative team. But he also insisted she take precautions. She started varying her route home from work. She had the paper's security experts sweep her car and her apartment for listening devices. The investigation had crossed a line. It was no longer just a story. It was a battle against an active and unseen enemy. Simone knew she needed to find a crack in the wall, a witness from the past who was willing to speak. The name Thelma Abbott had given her, Hattie Devereaux, became her obsession, but finding a retired nurse with a common last name after 30 years was a monumental task. She spent a week chasing down false leads, speaking to dozens of women named Hattie Devereaux, none of whom had ever worked at Crestwood. She was about to give up when a researcher on her team found a clue. A Hattie Mae Devereaux was listed as a board member for a small local church choir. The church was in the same neighborhood where many of the missing children had lived. Simone went to the church on a Sunday morning. She sat in the back pew, listening to the soaring gospel music, feeling like an intruder in this sacred space. After the service, she saw her. An older woman, her face kind and lined with age, her bearing graceful and dignified, greeting her friends. It was the woman from the church's newsletter photograph. It was Hattie Devereaux. Simone approached her cautiously, introducing herself. The moment she said the word Crestwood, a visible physical change came over the older woman. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a look of pure animal fear. Her friendly smile froze and then collapsed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Hattie whispered, her voice trembling. "I think you have the wrong person." She turned and walked away, almost running, leaving Simone standing alone in the emptying church. Simone was stunned by the intensity of her reaction. This was not the denial of someone with a faulty memory. This was the terror of a woman who had been living with a dangerous secret for her entire life. Hattie Devereaux was not just a witness. She was a prisoner, still held captive by the fear that had been instilled in her 3 decades ago. Simone knew she could not let it go. Hattie was the key. She was the only person alive who had seen the truth. Simone would have to find a way to reach her, to convince her that the truth was more powerful than the fear. But as she walked out of the church, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not just asking a woman to remember the past. She was asking her to risk her future. The fear that had silenced Hattie Devereaux for 30 years was a powerful, living thing. It had been her constant companion, a cold shadow that had followed her from the hallways of Crestwood to the quiet, peaceful life she had built for herself. The architect of that fear, Dr. Fiden, Julian Cross, was not a distant memory to her. He was a celebrated public figure. She saw his face on the news, his name on the donor plaques of museums and universities. He was a titan of the city, a man lauded for his philanthropy and his contributions to science. The idea that a retired nurse's testimony could bring down a man like that was laughable. The idea that he would not use his immense power to crush her for trying was terrifying. So when the young journalist, Simone Saint, James, had approached her at church, Hattie's first and only instinct was to run, but Simone was relentless. She did not harass Hattie, but she refused to let her go. She sent a carefully worded, respectful letter to Hattie's home, explaining the scope of her investigation and the evidence she had already uncovered. She included a copy of the list of names from the lab archives. She wrote about Thelma Abbott, about her 30 years of unanswered grief, about the shrine to her lost son in her living room. The letter was not a threat, it was an appeal to the good, compassionate nurse Hattie had once been, an appeal to the woman who had been so tormented by what she had seen that she had been compelled to keep a secret record of it. The letter sat on Hattie's kitchen table for 3 days, a silent, powerful accusation. Hattie could not bring herself to throw it away. Every time she looked at it, she saw the faces of the children. She saw the sleepy, confused eyes of Marcus Abbott as he was wheeled towards the basement elevator. She saw the trusting, hopeful face of his mother. The guilt, which she had managed to suppress for decades under a thick blanket of fear, began to resurface, raw and agonizing. The silence that had protected her for so long now felt like a betrayal. Simone made one final desperate gambit. She asked Thelma Abbott if she would be willing to go with her to speak to Hattie. Thelma agreed without hesitation. The next afternoon, 2 women, their lives linked by a shared, unspoken tragedy, knocked on Hattie Devereaux's door. When Hattie opened it and saw Thelma standing on her porch, her face a quiet testament to 30 years of pain, the wall of fear she had so carefully constructed around her heart finally began to crumble. They sat in Hattie's small, sunlit living room. It was not an interview. It was a confession. Thelma did not accuse. She simply spoke of her son. She spoke of his love for drawing, of his gap-toothed smile, of the promise of chocolate ice cream with sprinkles. She spoke of the empty bed and the cold, empty ache that had been her constant companion ever since. As she spoke, Hattie began to weep. The tears were for Marcus, for Thelma, for the dozens of other children and mothers, and for the part of her own soul she had been forced to sacrifice in order to survive. "I am so sorry," Hattie sobbed, her voice choked with a guilt that was 30 years old. "I was so scared. He told me he would destroy me. He would have taken my children. You have to understand." "I do understand," Thelma said, her voice filled with a grace and forgiveness that was almost superhuman. "But now, you have to help me. You have to tell the world what he did." The moment of decision had arrived. Hattie looked from the powerful, pleading eyes of the journalist to the deep, sorrowful eyes of the grieving mother. She could no longer live with the silence. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate, and went to a large cedar chest in the corner of the room. From the very bottom, wrapped in an old yellowed baby blanket, she retrieved a small spiral notebook. Her hands trembled as she handed it to Simone. "I wrote it all down," she whispered. "Their names, the dates they were taken. I couldn't stop him, but I made sure they weren't forgotten." Simone took the diary with a reverence usually reserved for a sacred text. This was it, the Rosetta Stone of the Crestwood conspiracy. It was the missing link, the human testimony that would connect the cold, clinical lab data to the stolen lives of the children. Hattie Devereaux, after 30 years of terrified silence, had finally chosen to speak. And with her small, secret diary, she was about to give a voice to the ghosts. The 2 documents, laid side by side on a large conference table in the Journal-Constitution building, told a single, horrifying story. On one side was the clinical, impersonal list of subject numbers and medical data from Dr. Cross's lab records. On the other was Hattie Devereaux's secret diary, a heartbreaking litany of names, dates, and the simple coded letters that represented a stolen child. Simone St. James, along with her editor and the paper's top lawyer, stared at the evidence. They knew they were looking at the blueprint of a mass murder, but to present it to the world, they needed to understand the science. They needed to translate the cold, technical jargon of the lab records into a language that a jury, and the public could understand. They reached out to Dr. Eleanor Vance, a retired professor from Emory University's medical school and a nationally recognized expert in medical ethics. Dr. Vance was a formidable woman in her 70s, with a razor-sharp mind and a deep, abiding contempt for anyone who violated the sacred trust between doctor and patient. Simone brought the documents to her, and for a week, Dr. Vance sequestered herself in her office, meticulously cross-referencing the lab data with Hattie's diary. When she finally called Simone back to her office, her face was pale, her expression a mixture of scientific fury and profound human sorrow. "What you have here," Dr. Vance began, her voice low and trembling with a controlled rage, "is the record of one of the most monstrous breaches of medical ethics I have ever seen. This is not research. This is barbarism dressed up in the language of science." She explained, in clear, simple terms, what the lab records revealed. Dr. Julian Cross, in 1972, had been developing a new, highly experimental immunosuppressant drug. The drug, which she identified from its chemical formula in the notes as cyclorine, was designed to be a powerful anti-rejection medication for organ transplant patients. In the early 70s, transplant science was still in its infancy, and the potential rewards for developing a successful immunosuppressant were enormous fame, fortune, and a place in the medical history books. "The problem," Dr. Vance continued, her finger tracing a line on one of the data sheets, "is that cyclorine was incredibly toxic. The initial animal trials, which are referenced here in his notes, showed a catastrophic rate of side effects. It caused kidney failure, liver necrosis, and a complete collapse of the body's ability to fight infection. The drug was a killer. Any reputable scientist would have abandoned the project immediately. But Dr. Cross had not abandoned it. He had moved on to the next phase of his research, human trials. He needed a specific kind of test subject, Dr. Vance explained, her voice dripping with contempt. He needed subjects who were healthy enough to provide a clean baseline, but who had a pre-existing condition that would allow him to justify administering an experimental treatment. And most importantly, he needed subjects who were powerless, subjects whose disappearance would not trigger a massive investigation. So he targeted the poor, black children who came through Crestwood's emergency room. The horrifying truth was now laid bare. Dr. Cross had used the children's common illnesses, asthma, sickle cell anemia, as a pretext. He would admit them, and then, under the guise of his specialized treatment protocol, he would begin administering massive, toxic doses of cyclorine. The lab records were a cold, methodical documentation of the drug's effects. He had recorded their slow, agonizing decline with the detached precision of a scientist observing rats in a cage. He noted their weight loss, their organ failure, the opportunistic infections that ravaged their small, defenseless bodies. Hattie's diary provided the final, heartbreaking piece of the puzzle. The date she recorded for each child's disappearance from the pediatric ward was the date they were taken to the quiet floor. The date of their death, which Dr. Cross had noted in his records as the termination of the trial, was always a week or two later. The children had not been transferred. They had been taken to his secret basement laboratory, where they had been systematically poisoned to death, their suffering meticulously recorded as clinical data. When they died, their bodies were likely disposed of in the hospital's medical waste incinerator, their existence erased from the world. "He was not trying to cure them, Doctor," Vance said, her voice a near whisper. "He was using them. He was sacrificing them on the altar of his own ambition. He needed to know what the drug would do to a human body, and he found a source of bodies that he believed no one would ever miss." Simone sat in the quiet, book-lined office, the full, monstrous weight of the truth settling over her. This was a story that was almost too terrible to believe. It was a story of a man who had hidden his sociopathic evil behind a mask of scientific brilliance and paternalistic charm. He had not just been a bad doctor, he had been a predator, and the city of Atlanta had unwittingly provided him with his own private hunting ground. The investigation was no longer just about uncovering a 30-year-old crime. It was about unmasking a monster who was still living among them. A monster who had built his celebrated career on a foundation of stolen children. The moment of reckoning could not take place in a sterile office or a quiet courtroom. The monster had to be confronted in his own curated world of prestige and respectability. Dr. Julian Cross, in the autumn of 2002, was the untouchable elder statesman of Atlanta's medical community. He was being honored at the annual Pinnacle of Medicine Charity Gala, a lavish, black-tie affair held at one of the city's most exclusive hotels. It was the perfect stage. Simone St. James, her press credentials giving her access to the event, felt a cold, hard knot of determination in her stomach. She was not just a reporter tonight. She was an avenging angel, and she was not coming alone. At her side, elegant and composed in a simple black dress, was Thelma Abbott. Thelma's presence was non-negotiable. She had to be there. She had to look the man who had stolen her son in the eye. The hotel ballroom was a glittering spectacle of wealth and power. The city's elite were all there, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries, their diamonds and their self-satisfaction sparkling under the crystal chandeliers. At the center of it all was Dr. Julian Cross. He was in his late 70s now, a handsome, silver-haired man who radiated an aura of intellectual gravitas and benevolent charm. He moved through the crowd like a king, accepting congratulations and accolades with a humble, practiced grace. To this world, he was a savior, a philanthropist, a man who had dedicated his life to the betterment of humanity. Simone and Thelma watched him from the edge of the room, the contrast between the public image and the private truth, a sickening, surreal chasm. Simone had arranged for a cameraman from her news station to be there, posing as a freelance event photographer. The plan was simple. She would wait for the right moment, a brief lull in the glad-handing, and she would confront him. Thelma stood beside her, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her body rigid with a tension that was 30 years in the making. She did not speak. She simply watched him, her eyes burning with a cold, quiet fire. The moment came. Dr. Cross was standing alone for a moment, near a large floral arrangement, a self-satisfied smile on his face. Simone approached him, her movements calm and deliberate. Thelma, a silent, powerful shadow at her side. "Dr. Cross," Simone said, her voice clear and steady. "Simone St. James, Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I have a few questions for you about the Crestwood Pediatric Immunology Program." The smile on Dr. Cross's face did not falter, but a flicker of something cold and hard entered his eyes. "That was a long time ago, Ms. St. James," he said, his tone one of polite, dismissive amusement. "A minor research project. I can't imagine it would be of any interest to your readers today. I think they'll be interested in the subjects of that research," Simone pressed, her voice unwavering. "Specifically, a boy named Marcus Abbott." At the mention of the name, the first crack appeared in his perfect, benevolent facade, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes, a slight stiffening of his posture. Thelma took a half-step forward, and Dr. Cross's gaze flickered to her. He did not recognize her, but he saw the look on her face, and for the first time, a hint of genuine unease crossed his features. "I'm afraid I don't recall that name," he said, his voice a little too smooth, a little too quick. "As I said, it was a long time ago. We had many patients. You had many subjects." Simone corrected him. She opened the portfolio she was carrying. "I have your lab records, doctor. The ones detailing your trials with cyclorine." She saw his jaw clench. He knew what she had. But he was a man who had been protected by his power for his entire life. He was not going to break. "Those records are confidential hospital property," he said, his voice taking on an icy, threatening edge. "I have no idea how you obtained them, but I can assure you, you are on very thin legal ice." He was about to turn away, to dismiss them, to call for security. But then, Simone played her final card. "I also have this," she said. She pulled out the second document from her portfolio. It was Hattie Devereaux's small spiral notebook, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it to the page where a neat, faded script read, "Marcus Abbott, September 12, 1972. A." Dr. Cross stared at the notebook. And in that moment, the mask of the celebrated philanthropist, the brilliant scientist, the benevolent savior, finally shattered. The blood drained from his face. The polite smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure reptilian fury. This was the one piece of the puzzle he had never known existed. The lab records could be explained away, dismissed as data. But this was a witness. This was a human hand, connecting his monstrous science to a stolen child. The hidden camera of Simone's photographer captured the moment perfectly. The flicker of panic, the flash of murderous rage in the eyes of the man who had been hiding a secret for 30 years. He looked from the diary to Simone, and then to Thelma. And in his eyes, Thelma Abbott finally saw not a doctor, but the monster who had swallowed her son whole. The story, when it broke, was not a story. It was a firestorm. Simone St. James's multi-page, front-page expose in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, titled "The Lost Children of Crestwood," landed with the force of a bomb, shattering the city's carefully constructed self-image. The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, a cold, meticulous presentation of the facts, interwoven with the heartbreaking, deeply human story of Thelma Abbott's 30-year search for her son. It was accompanied by the grainy, smiling photographs of the children, their innocent faces a powerful, silent accusation. The city, and the nation, was horrified. The story was picked up by the national news networks, and the name of Dr. Julian Cross, once a symbol of civic pride, became a byword for monstrous evil. The fallout was swift and total. The city's elite, the same people who had toasted him at the charity gala, rushed to distance themselves from him, their condemnations as loud as their previous praise had been. State and federal investigations were launched immediately. Dr. Cross, arrogant and defiant to the end, was arrested at his sprawling, opulent mansion. The image of the celebrated philanthropist being led away in handcuffs became the defining image of the scandal. His wall of money and influence, which had protected him for 3 decades, had crumbled in the face of a mother's love and a journalist's relentless pursuit of the truth. The legal proceedings were long and complex, but with the combined weight of the lab records and Hattie Devereaux's courageous, tearful testimony, the outcome was never in doubt. Dr. Julian Cross was convicted on multiple counts of manslaughter and unethical human experimentation. He would die in prison, a disgraced and reviled figure, his name forever linked not with healing, but with a crime of unimaginable cruelty. But the story was never just about the fall of one evil man. It was about the redemption of a city's soul. The Crestwood scandal forced Atlanta to confront a dark, painful chapter of its history, a chapter of institutional racism and official indifference that had allowed such an atrocity to occur. It led to sweeping reforms in the oversight of medical research and a renewed commitment to protecting the city's most vulnerable citizens. A year after the story broke, on a cool, clear autumn day, a crowd gathered on a newly landscaped green space in the heart of the city's south side. It was the site where the derelict Crestwood General Hospital had finally been demolished. In its place was a beautiful new park, a place of playgrounds and flower gardens, a place of life and hope. At the center of the park stood a simple, elegant wall of polished black granite. The dedication ceremony was a somber, quiet affair. The mayor spoke, as did leaders of the city's black community. Simone St. James was there, standing quietly in the crowd. So was Hattie Devereaux, no longer a prisoner of her fear, but a quiet, dignified hero. Thelma Abbott stood before the wall, and on it, inscribed in clean, simple letters, were the names of the lost children: Abbott, Marcus, Baker, Daniel, Collins, Loretta. Dozens of names, rescued from the darkness of a lab record and returned to the light of memory. Thelma reached out and traced the letters of her son's name. The tears that fell were not tears of grief, but of a quiet, profound peace. It was not the son she had lost, the vibrant, laughing boy who loved to draw superheroes, but it was the truth. It was an acknowledgement. It was a final, somber act of justice. The children of Crestwood had finally come home.